Somewhere in North Carolina, more than 400 years ago, 115 men, women, and children vanished so completely that historians are still arguing about it. No bodies, no battle, no burned settlement, just an overgrown fort, a few stripped houses, and 2 words carved into wood. That should have been enough to close the case. It wasn't. Centuries of archaeology, folklore, fabricated stones, and competing theories have all taken their turn at the mystery without finishing it. Every lead either dissolves under scrutiny or opens 3 new questions on its way out. Then DNA science arrived, and what it found wasn't buried at a dig site. It wasn't hiding under a patch on an old map. It was written in the genes of people who had been offering the answer for generations and being largely ignored while they did it. That changes the shape of this story considerably. To understand what the DNA found, you need to understand why Roanoke was already a disaster before anyone went missing. The story begins in 1584, when 2 English ships crossed the Atlantic to scout a location for the first permanent English colony in America. They landed on the outer banks of present-day North Carolina, developed friendly relations with the local tribes, and returned home with encouraging reports. Walter Raleigh, freshly knighted, named the territory Virginia and immediately began planning something larger. What followed was a series of decisions that compound badly. The 1585 colony arrived with roughly 600 men and enough provisions for a year. The flagship ran aground on a shallow inlet and destroyed most of the food supply. The colony was reduced to around 100 men. Relations with the surrounding tribes collapsed under the weight of disease, overdependence, and a colonial governor paranoid enough to massacre a village on suspicion of a plot that may never have existed. Francis Drake evacuated the survivors 9 months later. 3 men were left behind in the chaos. They were never found. If the first colony established anything, it was a pattern. John White returned in 1587 as governor of a second attempt, this time with families, including his pregnant daughter, Eleanor. The plan was to settle at Chesapeake Bay, which was deeper, safer, and considerably more sensible than Roanoke. The fleet's navigator, Fernandez, ignored the plan entirely and deposited everyone on the same island that had just failed. White, outranked in practice if not in title, did not stop him. Pressured by the colonists to return to England for supplies, White left 115 people behind, including his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare. He returned 3 years later to find the colony stripped, overgrown, and completely empty. 2 words carved into the wood. No cross indicating distress, no bodies, no explanation. Just Croatoan, and then silence. John White himself was not particularly confused by the carving. Before he left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a system. If they relocated, they would carve their destination. If they were in danger, they would add a cross. There was no cross. White concluded they had moved to Croatoan Island, roughly 50 miles south, where the friendly Hatteras people lived. He tried to sail there. The anchor cable snapped. He never made it. That was the last time he crossed the Atlantic. Simple enough, except for one line buried in White's own notes. Before he departed in 1587, the colonists were already discussing a move approximately 50 miles into the mainland. Croatoan is an island, not the mainland. That single sentence has been quietly undermining the tidy explanation for 4 centuries. What followed was centuries of theories, each more confident than the evidence warranted. John Smith reported in 1608 that Powhatan had described men in European clothing living nearby. An acquaintance later claimed Powhatan confessed to massacring the colonists. Smith himself never mentioned this confession, and Smith was not a man who typically left dramatic details on the table. Reports of native children with pale skin and blonde hair circulated for generations, until someone pointed out that albinism occurs at significantly higher rates in Native American populations than European ones. John Lawson visited the Hatteras tribe in 1701 and found Gray Eyes surnames and a tradition that their ancestors had been white and able to read. Two independent sources, a century apart, pointing toward Croatoan. Compelling, but not conclusive. Then came the Dare Stones, a series of inscribed rocks supposedly left by Eleanor Dare herself. All confirmed forgeries, except possibly the first, which remains genuinely contested and conveniently impossible to verify. 400 years of breadcrumbs, nothing that closes the case. While historians were debating carvings and contested stones, one group had been offering an answer for generations and receiving considerably less attention than the question deserved. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, approximately 55,000 members, making them one of the largest tribes east of the Mississippi and one of the least federally recognized, which is a bureaucratic situation with its own complicated history. What concerns us here is what the Lumbee have been saying about their own origins for as long as anyone recorded them saying anything. Their oral tradition holds that their ancestors included survivors of the lost colony, not as mythology, not as metaphor, as genealogy. The specifics are difficult to dismiss entirely. Family surnames documented within the Lumbee community, names like Dial, Chavis, Cooper, and Berry, appear in the surviving records of the Roanoke colony. Gray Eyes, the same detail Lawson noted among the Hatteras in 1701, were documented among Lumbee families well into the modern era. The geographical overlap is not coincidental. The Lumbee's ancestral territory sits precisely in the region where the evidence keeps pointing. Historians categorize this as folklore. Interesting folklore, perhaps, but folklore nonetheless. The kind of origin story that communities construct around a compelling local mystery rather than actual memory. The Lumbee's ongoing struggle for full federal recognition meant their history was politically inconvenient to validate, and the easier path was to leave the mystery unsolved than to credit the people who claim to have solved it. The DNA researchers who eventually turned their attention to this question were not arriving with answers. They were arriving with a method. The question they were actually testing had already been answered by the Lumbee consistently across centuries. The researchers were simply the first ones to bring equipment that the academic establishment might find persuasive. Here is where the story stops being folklore and starts being biology. Genetic researchers working with Lumbee's community members use genealogical DNA testing to trace lineage through haplogroups, the inherited markers carried in mitochondrial DNA along maternal lines and Y chromosomes along paternal ones. These markers don't lie about deep ancestry. They don't exaggerate. They simply record what happened, in the language of biology, across centuries. What they found in specific Lumbee's family lines was European haplogroups appearing in places and patterns that demanded explanation. Not random European contact markers of the kind that appear across dozens of tribes following centuries of colonial interaction, something more specific. The genetic signature was consistent with a small founding population event, a relatively contained group of European individuals who merged with a larger indigenous community at a single point in time, rather than through gradual and repeated contact across generations. That distinction matters enormously. Later, European contact with Native American populations came from different regions of England, different parts of Europe entirely, carrying different genetic profiles. The markers appearing in these particular Lumbee's lines do not match that pattern. They are consistent with 16th century English ancestry specifically, which is a considerably narrower corridor than European ancestry generally. The Lumbee's genetic profile also shows deep Native American ancestry as its dominant signal, which is precisely what genuine integration looks like, not replacement, not displacement, but two populations becoming one over sufficient generations that the boundary dissolves. An additional finding quietly supported the geographical argument. Certain Lumbee's genetic markers connect to coastal Algonquian populations, the same people Manteo and Wanchese came from, the same tribes the Roanoke colonists had lived alongside, What the DNA cannot do is name names or confirm dates. What it can do is make integration the most biologically plausible explanation currently on the table. That is not a solved mystery. It is a probability that has finally caught up with an oral tradition that was never wrong. Put all of it together and a coherent picture emerges. Not a proven one, but a coherent one. White leaves in August 1987. The war with Spain locks him in England for 3 years. The colonists, who had agreed to wait, eventually stop waiting. The question is not whether they moved. The carved post and the stripped houses make clear they left deliberately and without panic. The question is where. The evidence suggests the answer is not one place, but two. One group almost certainly moved to Croatoan. The carving says so. The absence of a distress cross says so. White's own interpretation, from a man who designed the signaling system himself, says so. The Hatteras oral tradition, documented by Lawson a century later, says so. That part of the story has always been reasonably well supported. The second group moved inland. White's own notes mention the colonists discussing a move 50 miles into the mainland before he even departed. The concealed fort symbol on his map places an unmarked settlement approximately that distance west of Roanoke. Archaeological work at Site X has recovered English-era pottery fragments and metal pieces that don't belong to any known later settlement. A severe regional drought documented immediately after 1987 adds another layer. This wasn't only about safety or politics, it was about water and food, the things that actually kill people when they run out. Integration followed because survival required it. And after enough years, enough seasons, enough children born, knowing only one life, integration simply became identity. The English surnames persisted in some families. The gray eyes persisted in others. The story persisted in the oral tradition of people who saw no reason to forget where they came from. The lost colony was not lost. It became something else. The people who remembered that most clearly were the ones history spent the longest time not asking. There is an uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, and it is worth asking directly. If the Lumbee have been offering this answer for centuries and the geographical evidence has been pointing in the same direction for nearly as long, and John Lawson documented supporting details in 1701, why did it take a DNA test for the academic establishment to treat any of it as worth taking seriously? The answer is not flattering. Indigenous oral tradition has historically been ranked below written European accounts in terms of historical credibility, not because it is less reliable, but because the people doing the ranking were European. The Lumbee were providing testimony about their own ancestry and having it filed under folklore, while historians debated the authenticity of stones that turned out to be fake. That is a particular kind of irony that does not improve on examination. The Lumbee's long struggle for full federal recognition added a political dimension that made validating their origin story genuinely inconvenient. Acknowledging that their history was accurate would have complicated a bureaucratic process that various administrations found easier to defer than resolve. The mystery framing did not help either. Ghost stories, forged stones, hidden maps, and encrypted symbols are more commercially interesting than the straightforward answer that the people who survived simply went to live with their neighbors. The entertainment value of an unsolved mystery consistently outweighed the credibility of the people who had solved it. DNA research within Native American communities also requires something that takes time to build: trust. Some tribes have refused genetic testing entirely because results have previously been weaponized to dispute land rights and undermine sovereignty claims. The Lumbee's willingness to participate was not a given. The science did not discover something new. It confirmed something the Lumbee already knew, in a language that required no translation for the people who had previously declined to listen. The lost colony was never particularly lost. It was absorbed, integrated, and remembered by the people who lived alongside it, and then remembered again by their descendants, who kept the surnames and the gray eyes and the story intact across 4 centuries while historians looked elsewhere. The DNA doesn't deliver a courtroom verdict. It shifts the weight of evidence decisively toward survival and integration and away from massacre, shipwreck, or disappearance into nothing. Croatoan was not a dying message. It was a forwarding address. 400 years of framing this as a European mystery managed to overlook the people carrying the answer in their names, their oral tradition, and eventually their genes. The Lumbee were right. They were right consistently across centuries, without any equipment beyond memory. History occasionally rewards that kind of patience. It just took a DNA test and 400 years to officially admit it.